Advent, first week of Advent, happy that. And that opens our Merry Christmas season. So Merry Christmas to you. And belated Black Friday. And premature Cyber Monday. And Giving Tuesday. So much just going on. Do you not feel like it's just filled? It's not filled enough, apparently. The ad people want to sell us all these things, all these seasonal occasions in our public sphere. But on top of all of that, what do we have? This. Everywhere. Wicked. Do you not agree it is everywhere? It's like the last 3 months of our lives. Everywhere you look. Commercials here, that. Target has wicked commercials. And then the movie has wicked commercials. There are over 400 tie-ins that Wicked has with different companies, all the way to this. It's a macaroni and cheese in 2 different colors. So that you can be, I don't know, what are the characters? It's like Elphaba and Glinda, right? It's everything. It's all around us. Everyone is a promoter or a sponsor of this movie. And we all know this is the IP strategy, right? Intellectual property strategy that has surrounded us. They take all of our beloved stories and they build on these stories, whether it's our space operas or our cartoons or our beloved fantasy novels. The studios are taking the seeds of those stories and opening the door to the past, to the future of them, to different dimensions of them, so that we see the bigger picture of why was Cruella so cruel, right? or the Wicked Witch may not have been so wicked. That's this story, right? Or how did that space station ending trench get there? Who builds a Death Star with a trench that says, hey, come bomb me so it'll explode the whole thing? How did that get there? Because of the larger narratives. Because of the bigger augmented realities that they now present to us. As we enter Advent, we're familiar. Birth of Jesus, Joseph, Mary, baby in the feeding trough, the shepherds, Herod's anger, and his slaughter of the Israelite babies. In the first century, they were also familiar with all the details of the birth of Jesus. Matthew, Luke, big gospel stories, recording Jesus' birth diligently so we could celebrate and commemorate and meditate on Jesus. And so when the writer of the very last gospel, John, comes to this task of telling the story of Jesus, comes with a totally different mission, comes with a totally different agenda. John comes inspired by the Spirit of God, and his intention is to crack open the world of Christmas for us, to show us a whole new perspective on the coming of Jesus. Not the virgin birth, not Mary, not Joseph, not the angels or the shepherds, not the many details that would then go into this dovetailing story of Jesus being lowly born, but like heavenly celebrated. John, he backs up and he tells us the big picture. The big picture of Jesus, to move us to a deeper understanding and a greater appreciation and a higher worship of Jesus as we ponder his coming. So this is our today and our next 3 Sundays, the 4 Sundays of Advent, will be spent in this first chapter of the book of John. We're going to be zooming out and discovering the universe of this augmented universe of Advent, the wonders of God's love. So if you've got your Bibles with you this morning, to turn to our passage this morning is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. John 1, 1 through 5. Of course, as we mention every week, you can just crack open also your bulletin. We always print the passage there. You can just follow up here on our PowerPoint. Now, this is John's account of the birth, or the coming, the advent of Jesus. John writes this to us. He says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. It's John. It's how the author John begins the narrative of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Not in Bethlehem, with the census of Caesar. No, that's Luke. Not with the genealogy, but here talking about Jesus as the Word. And before we get to the text, as we always do, we have to ask, why? What's the context of this passage such that John takes this special and very different approach compared to the other gospels? What we call the synoptic gospels, right? Those who see with one another. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels because they see everything very similarly. But John kind of steps out of the lane and says, I'm going to see things a little bit differently, right? But why is he different? And we've mentioned the first reason already, of course, and that's because John is writing his account of Jesus at the very end of the first century. A lot of scholars peg the writing of this last account of Jesus' life, written about AD 90. AD 90, the close of the first century. And all the other Gospels are written not too far after Jesus' death and his resurrection. So John, he's got this extra time. With the extra time, he's got extra perspective. And he's got distance and the ability now to communicate the narrative of Jesus on a more conceptual, a more theological level. That's the first purpose that motivates John. Simply not to be redundant and tell the same thing over again, but to give a different and a larger perspective. At the same time, as the followers of Jesus have gone out into the world and told the world about the news of Jesus, well, kind of a game of telephone has happened. There have been ill-meaning people along the way that have arisen and tried to corrupt the true picture of who Jesus is. The first century common corruption of true faith was something called Gnosticism. Gnosticism, with the whole like silent G going on there, right? For people who kind of wanted a few more do's and don'ts in their lives. That's Gnosticism, right? They concoct this system of do's and don'ts around this worldview that everything that is physical, everything out there and all of our bodies and all the stuff that's created, it's kind of icky. Everything physical is evil and not spiritual. Everything spiritual is great. All the invisible things and God and the Spirit, that's all perfect and holy. But all of this is yuck. So the creation, since it was the creation of physical stuff, was not accomplished by God himself. They said, oh, that's all devil stuff. The devil created all of this, and everything done in our bodies, evil. So they were rather ascetic. They avoided everything. That was one early corruption that was popular in the first century. And it corrupted not just Christianity, but also early Judaism, these Jewish communities, Gnosticism. Related to Gnosticism was a teaching by a man named, let's get this right, Corinthus. And so his followers followed Corinthianism. Not Corinth, but Corinthianism. Popular also in the first century, the latter part of the first century. Very similar to Gnosticism. Corinthus taught that God was not the creator of the universe, but again, like Gnosticism, they had this other thing called the demiurge that created the universe and all of us. And Corinthus taught that Jesus had a normal human birth, with Joseph and Mary was their biological child. But then, because all of us, we're all very evil, then some spiritual being comes upon Jesus, descends upon him, and enters him at his baptism, and then leaves Jesus at his crucifixion, denying the deity and the unity of Jesus. Early historians actually record that our writer John knew of Corinthus and opposed his teaching. John once entered into, Romans had these bathhouses that they went into to bathe. John goes into this Roman bathhouse, and he hears that Corinthus is also in the same bathhouse. And so he flees the bath before taking the bath, and he says this, "Let us fly, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Corinthus, the enemy of the truth, is inside." So this motivates John to write his account of Jesus, to tell the bigger truth about who Jesus is and set the record straight from, right, this is the horse's mouth. John is an apostle, someone who walked and talked and experienced Jesus. So these corrupting influences, he's writing this gospel against them so that they cannot flourish. And so John begins this Christmas narrative, this account of Jesus' coming with these truths about Jesus. 3 in particular. The first is this: Jesus is the eternal God. That's the first truth that he begins with. Jesus is the eternal God. He's fully God and has always been fully God. Against Corinthus, right? Or as John puts it, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. You've heard these verses probably, and if you have, you know John's not writing this in some vacuum. No, John writes this opening as a throwback to the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. That tells us in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth, right? In the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth. Oh, in the beginning was the Word. Right there. So clearly, John has had enough of this nonsense of Jesus being born to the biological son of Joseph and Mary, or that Jesus is not God incarnate. John makes it as explicit as possible for us. What's the big claim of Genesis? The big claim of Genesis is that God is the one and only God. All these other gods in Old Testament times, they had family idols for each household. The pantheon of Egyptian gods, you had Isis and Osiris and Set and Horus, or the gods of the Canaanites, Baal and Asherah and Chemoth. They did not compare to the God of the Israelites, because those gods were gods of death and fertility and the frogs and this and that. But the God of the Israelites, our God, was in the beginning. He's first. He's forever. He preceded all of those things, so he's the true one and only God over all. John's saying, that God of Israel, yeah, Jesus is fully him. Jesus is fully him. And so there's this contrast, right? There's Matthew, there's Mark, there's Luke. They begin with genealogies or birth narratives, or Jesus just bursting onto the scene in ministry. John says, great. But that's not the beginning. The Word, Jesus, was pre-incarnate. And not only was Jesus around before his birth, Jesus was around before his own family tree. He was before the census of Caesar that Luke mentions. He's before the angel's announcement. He was before Abraham. Remember, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Before Adam, before Eve, before the garden, Jesus was in the beginning. Jesus was in Genesis. Overlay that history of Jesus with the whole plan of God, and Jesus was there with God the Father. Now, we used to think, when I think Genesis, I think about God the Father. Now when you think Genesis, think Jesus. Because Jesus was in the beginning with the Father. And Jesus has always been, he is God. So clearly we're talking prequel. This is prequel material. We're stepping out of what we usually think about Christmas, and now we know this augmented universe of Jesus, and that Jesus doesn't just show up at Bethlehem. Jesus has always been. Jesus is not an addition or a New Testament personage. Jesus has been and is and always has been around. Jesus is the eternal God. This is John's first point about the coming of Jesus, is that Jesus came into our world. That doesn't mean that Jesus came into existence. Jesus is the eternal God. Second point of John is this: Jesus is the creator. Jesus is the creator. That Jesus, God the Son, second person of the Trinity, wasn't just sitting around on the bench for thousands of years. Get called up to bat when, incarnation is on the plate. Yeah, come on, Jesus. No. Jesus is God involved just as much as the Father and the Spirit are God involved. So, yes, Jesus created, as John says, all things came into being through him. Apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. This is again against this heresy that somehow God is not involved in the creation, that some demiurge or satanic force created, or within, right, that some evil force is there. God is the creator, Father, Son, and Spirit. And in particular, the baby in the feeding trough. It's not Jesus' first rodeo. Jesus didn't just show up in Bethlehem and be created. Jesus was creating way before he was born. There's this irony there. And in fact, Jesus created everything. John goes on to emphasize, not only was Jesus involved in the creation, Jesus is involved in all of creating. All creative work. Not just in Genesis chapter 1, but the constant, continual making of all things. That's Jesus. Apart from Jesus, nothing comes into being that has come into being. Jesus created Joseph. Jesus created Mary. All of the greats of the grandparents before Jesus, like Jacob and Ezekiel and David and Boaz and Abraham, Jesus has created his whole family line. And mine and yours, the whole lineage. And the fish and the trees and the fields and the shepherds in Bethlehem and the mountains that rang out with the songs of the angels and the star that guided all of the wise men and all of their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Jesus created all of those things. We marvel at the birth account, right? How all these things come into play and they all interlock and it's all miraculous about this whole scene. But when we understand how Jesus is the creator, that's not so far out of God's wheelhouse, right? That's Jesus could do those things. But also, we're to realize that Jesus, his creative role does not stop at Genesis. Meaning that it does not stop in the Old Testament. It doesn't stop in the New Testament. Nothing comes into being without Jesus. All of us, all of our stories, all the stories around us, all the people around us, the creation that we are seeing, Jesus is the creative power, upholding everything in our current moment. So, he's our maker, the maker of everything. Point 2. So he's creator, he's eternal God. Finally, John's third point is Jesus is revealer. Revealer. John, he begins this corollary. He says this is the identity of Jesus. If Jesus is creator, then Jesus is the giver of life. This is verse 4, right? He's the giver of life. In him was life. This is the source of Jesus' creative power, life. But then John flips the script and he says, that life, the real power, is actually light. The light of men. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. That there's this physical life we experience, we get created by Jesus, but then there's this dimension of light that is really energizing. Light energizes us. And it's not just physical light, right? You know, the packets and the waves, all that kind of stuff that you learn about in physics. It's not that physical light, obviously, because all of creation gets that light from the sun. But this is the light that is the light of men. So clearly this is kind of a spiritual, internal light that God supplies that provides us things like guidance and wisdom and seeing what's good versus evil and everything that is from Jesus and that is Jesus. Jesus being light is, it's Christmas. Jesus being light is Christmas. It's Jesus coming to us and telling us and showing us and being God right in front of us. Or as the writer of Hebrews says, that Jesus is the radiance of his glory, God's glory, and the exact representation of his nature. The nature of Jesus being light is Jesus being the revealer. He uncovers for us who God is. We want to see, what's God like? Or who is God? Why doesn't God just show up and show us that he's here and that he's real and that he loves us and what kind of love that love is like and what he thinks of us and how he cares? Why doesn't God just show up and do that? Well, John says, yeah, he has. That's Jesus. Jesus is the light for us. But, and this is the challenging transition, The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. The darkness didn't comprehend it. Immediately jolted back to, oh, well, then there's us. there's the rest of us. Every timeline of ours. We see that as John's account here is overlaid with the Christmas account, here at Jesus' birth, Jesus comes at every single turn, is rejected, and his light is denied. His virgin birth, nobody believed it. This is why Joseph and Mary enter into all of these hard choices that they have to make. He's got these 3 wise men, right? They celebrate Jesus as king and as savior, but instead of hailing him, what does everybody else do? Well, the authorities try and hunt Jesus down and slaughter him. Angels announce, just like countless angels. Angels here, angels there. There's angels all over the birth account. And they're all talking about Jesus coming. People are not lining up to welcome Jesus. The only people who RSVP for the first Christmas party are the dirtiest and the lowliest who just come from the field smelling of sheep. And that theme reprises at every single turn throughout the life of Jesus. Jesus is showing people his eternal creator godness. He's being light to people. He's telling people that he's the light. He's shining in the darkness. But then Jesus is rejected and misunderstood and eventually crucified. The darkness that doesn't understand. We reject and we resist. We go our own way and choose our own paths. And that's the last point that John leaves to us to return to. He's continuing to open this bigger picture, but then remember, Jesus comes as the light. When the light comes into the world, we don't handle it very well. We kind of close our eyes. So that's the Christmas narrative cracked open, kind of from the top down. What is additive about John's account? Like, how are we supposed to somehow take this and have something new and different and respond and experience Jesus' coming differently and have this prequely zoom out affect our lives? First application is pretty clear, and that's to live the big picture, or the bigger picture than we usually live. That in light of knowing that Jesus is the eternal God, who created all things, created us and our lives and everything around us, and who is daily intruding into our lives to show us as the light more of himself, he's shining into our lives. Our perspectives and our thinking and our values and our hearts need to reflect that bigger narrative, the bigger realities. That we don't just live day by day, kind of slogging through as a cog in the machine of life, doing what everybody else does and slogging through what's expected of us. We're to place ourselves in this larger narrative of, oh, I get it now. That's what life is all about. Jesus was and is the plan. From forever in the past to forever in the future. It's Jesus created with God the Father and God the Spirit, and this whole Christmas was planned and created just like today is planned and created. And your fate and my fate and all the histories of the histories, God's been there. This redemptive story. And so the relevant question is no longer, well, so what am I supposed to do today? But what is God doing? What's God's big plan? And if God is moving, like he's always moved, like through Jesus, and he's got this trajectory of creating and revealing and redeeming, by golly, how am I part of that? What should I not be doing? What should I be doing in order to get what Jesus and what Jesus is doing? Jesus is the bigger narrative. Jesus is the story. How do I get on board with him? This is what a zoom out does for us. It puts us like in perspective. Life is not about me. My question shouldn't start with, oh, me? What should I do? No, life comes from, is originating from, and is all about Jesus. And so all of our questions need to start with Jesus. What's he doing? What's his plan? How am I going to join him in what he's doing? I have to apologize in advance because I'm going to break one of my rules of illustration. I have these little, they're just my rules, but I'm gonna break it. And that rule of illustration is I never share on a single movie, because you take a room full of people, and not everybody's seen that movie. You could take a room full of 100 people and ask, who hasn't seen Star Wars? And invariably, there's someone who's gonna raise their hand. And you go, how is that possible? But it's always possible. There's always, no one sees all the, but I'm gonna break that rule because we just rewatched this movie. And last Monday, we rewatched last Monday, and the sequel came out almost concurrently, right? Little insight into our household, also the reason why we're talking about this. Last week, we had a very, very long discussion on what's the best princess movie. We're very, very odd people, very small, odd people in our household. But we had, this discussion lasted multiple days. And my top princess was Moana. Yeah. And then I thought, oh, I forgot Rapunzel and Tangled. And so I had to switch, because Tangled is just wonderful. Anyway, but what I did not realize, so that's what led us to, we had to rewatch this movie. It was an imperative because this debate was raging. So, but I did not realize as I rewatched this movie, excuse the pun, it's a deep dive. Moana is a deep. This is no fun like family romp. No, there are themes of trauma and redemption, generational dysfunction, and wow, this movie's like, whoa. If you have not seen it, this is not going to ruin it for you. Hopefully, it will enhance your experience when you do see this movie. And if you do rewatch it, I do hope that you rewatch it with new goggles on. Because there's a huge theme running throughout this movie of Moana about, what is my destiny? Yes? What is my destiny? What is my role? And it's dealt with in a very surprisingly mature way. This is not, oh, I'm a Disney princess, where's my prince kind of movie. No, this is from the very opening scene, Moana the movie, does exactly what John is doing. If you remember, the first 5 minutes of this movie tells us the meta-narrative of Maui and Tafiti and Taka and creation and humanity. All of this whole world building, only then to launch into this first act where we meet the character Moana. And she is asking what? Where's my place? Who am I? Why do I have certain longings? And where do I fit in? And that's the whole movie. It's not just this like self-ish, kind of self-narrative, like self-actualization, I need to be who I am. It's a journey of what is the big picture and what's the ocean calling me to do? Why is it chosen Moana? What's the history of this people from Motunui, right? She discovers, right, the whole thing. Oh, they were voyagers. Wow! That was such a huge moment. Why? Because I understand where I'm fitting into that. And only in understanding the big story can Moana answer, who am I? What's my part? The musical climax, if you remember, in the whole movie, this is not, I don't think it'll ruin it for you, but it's this statement. Moana says, I am Moana. And you're like, come on, that's kind of like anticlimax. What kind of lyric is that? Who made that up? But no, it's super, super poignant because she finally understands. I get it now. I fit in to this. This is what I'm supposed to do in order for that to happen. And this is where John is pointing us. This is the big picture. The big picture is Jesus, eternal creator God, coming to reveal himself and show us and lead us and guide us. All of our questions, it started with Jesus. His plan and his direction. How do we get with his program and serve him? And ultimately, how do we respond to this? The fact that Jesus comes and he does not dominate. He does not command or control everyone. And ultimately, Jesus comes and is humble. And he's living and giving and loving. And he comes not to take, but to give his life. Taking all the punishment that we deserve. Dying on the cross to pay for our blindness and our rebellion against God. And then Jesus reveals our lives. Jesus' story is a redemptive story. What are we supposed to do with that? Where do we fit in with that? How do we daily respond and fit into that bigger plan? It's a new perspective. But it begins with this shift, living the bigger picture. Not our little concerns over, oh, what do I want? Or oh, how do I please me, meet expectations so that people like respect me or think highly about me, or my family appreciates me, or my people advance. No, live the bigger picture. The picture of Jesus and his redemptive will and his intentions. Application number 1. Application number 2 is from our cliffhanger. That's seek the light. Seek the light. John lays it out here. The light shines in the darkness. Darkness did not comprehend it. There are all these truths about Jesus. There are all these truths about the big picture. How Jesus comes and he saves, he redeems, he dies for us, he loves us, he offers us forgiveness. And then he calls us as ambassadors to this transformative message. Share with other people what this is all about. Light shines, but then we tend to retreat into the shadows and hide from it rather than be illuminated. We like wallowing in our darkness. John's light shining in the darkness with the darkness not comprehending it. That statement is a wake-up call to push against our natural tendencies. To see, we're prone to leave the God who loves us and run with what we want, to believe rather the things that we are always like ensconced in rather than what Jesus reveals to be true. But Jesus, the light, is shining. And I know that we've talked rather quite a bit about technology and artificial intelligence. Right? Dan came last week and he gave us a huge primer on artificial intelligence. Fantastic. The advent of Skynet and all the evils that are going to descend upon our lives. But there is something really, really good about the amount of information that this revolution and tech revolution has produced for us. I don't know how to describe it. We're much more submissive, inquisitive, pliable. I don't know how you really describe it, but I think we've all seen this, right? We actually listen to and believe Siri and Alexa and Wiki this and IMBD that, and all of these different sources of information that this revolution has supplied us. If I've got a question, I got this thing on the back of my arm, and I'm like, oh, so what's that thing? I don't know. That just kind of cropped up. Where do I go? Well, I just go to WebMD, and I go, oh, so what's this? I take a picture of it, and I compare it to the pictures on the, oh, that's what that is. I don't have to worry about that until it grows, right? And then whoa, what's the weather tomorrow? Hey, Alexa, hey, Alexa, what's the weather tomorrow? Step away. Or the person, I think we were talking about, like, the prince said, oh, who did the voice of this? Or the voice of Flynn Rider? And it just comes right out. Or is it worth going? I was thinking, oh, maybe we should go to the Astra Lumina thing up at the South Coast Botanical Gardens. It's $50. I go to TripAdvisor and say, hey, is that worth the $50? He said, no. I don't, maybe you think it's good. But the internet has put this wealth of information at each of our beck and call. And in doing so, it's changed our relationship to knowing. I can know lots of things now that would have been hard to know. But now they're just right there. Yesterday, cutting the turkey. How do I carve the turkey? How do I hang the Christmas lights? Anything and everything. This fire hose of availability has increased our expectation that, things are knowable. Things are learnable. If I want to know them and learn them and see them, they're there. That's a great place to be. Because John is saying this. Jesus is shining. Jesus is revealing. Jesus wants us to know him. We have a God that wants us to know him. That's the nature of Jesus, to show us. In the book of James, James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously and without reproach. And so that's our last application, really. Very simple. Seek Jesus. Know that he is revealing himself to us. He's revealing his saving work constantly. He's revealing his will and his big plan, how we can be part of what he's doing. Jesus is not a God who hides. Jesus is the light. He's coming into our darkness and shining.